This is Meade Crosby and her plant love story, Kelp, a surfer's guide to the most lovable plant impersonator in the water.
This is a story about kelp, which will begin with two caveats. The first, and most obvious, is that kelp is not actually a plant, but it is so similar to a plant, I'd argue, that I'm going to give it a pass for the purposes of plant love. Kelp is in fact a large brown seaweed, but it could easily be mistaken for a plant. It anchors itself to the ocean floor with a strong root-like structure called a holdfast, from which a long stem, called a stipe, extends upward, sprouting luxuriant, glossy long leaves called blades that reach up to the ocean surface to catch the sunlight. Kelp grows in cold coastal waters, often forming large, dense patches called forests. When I think about plant love, kelp is the first thing that comes to my mind. Which brings me to my second caveat, which is that my love for kelp is actually more of a love-hate relationship, but it's mostly love. And that's because I'm a surfer. Surfers are very particular about their waves. We want waves with smooth green faces. These unbroken moving walls of water are our canvas, our playing field. For that reason, we typically don't want to surf waves that have been made by local winds or nearby storms, because these waves are usually messy and weak, making them no fun to surf. We want waves that have traveled long distances from storms far, far away, storms that we'll never see. The swells that bring these waves have been groomed by their long journey through the ocean, arriving to us clean and strong and organized, with no sign of the storms that made them. Thus, it's a real shame when one of these beautiful long-distance swells arrives, but nearby winds have introduced chop into the water, messing everything up. And that's where kelp comes in. Kelp, with its long, straight stems and flowing leaves, acts like this beautiful, glossy comb or sieve through the water. The long-distance swells with enough energy pass right through, but those messy, low-energy local waves hit the kelp, and poof, they disappear. Thus, waves that pass through kelp are groomed. They're glassy and clean and liquid and perfect. As long as the kelp is in deep water out past where the breaking waves are, and that's typical of the bull kelp that grows where I live in the Pacific Northwest, then that kelp is a surfer's best friend. Sometimes, though, kelp is a surfer's worst nightmare. If you have to paddle through it, or if it's growing right where the wave you want to surf is breaking, because it is a cruel, slow, Sisyphus-like experience to paddle through kelp. And if you try to catch a wave in kelp, it will stop your board in its tracks and you will go flying over the handlebars. But sometimes, the kelp is in a sweet spot, growing right where the wave you want to surf is breaking, but too sparse or too low in the water to interfere when the wave rises up and it's time for you to hop on. This is sometimes the case at my favorite surf spot, which has strong currents when the tide is changing, making it almost impossible to stay in the right spot to catch a wave. So when I'm surfing there, and I don't want to keep paddling on an endless conveyor belt, tiring myself out against the tide, I wrap the kelp around me to stay in place during lulls, like a seatbelt or a harness, just like sea otters do when they sleep, so they don't drift out to sea. And it is a magical thing to be floating in the ocean, feeling the pull of the tide, held in the strong, silky arms of kelp. So here's to kelp, the plant that is not a plant, but that is, except when it isn't, every surfer's favorite plant in the water.
Thanks, Meade.